house sat at the end of a winding road in Princeton, West Virginia, tucked between dense clusters of trees that whispered with every passing breeze. It wasn't grand or imposing, just a modest, ranch-style home with a wide porch and a sloping roof, nestled into the quiet Appalachian landscape. Eric and Lisa Caldwell weren't looking for a house with history. They just wanted something peaceful, away from the chaos of city life. They had spent years in Washington, D.C., grinding through office jobs, and when Lisa inherited a small sum from her late father, they saw it as a chance to start fresh. The realtor mentioned in passing that the house once belonged to Bob Denver, the actor best known as Gilligan from Gilligan's Island. Eric had chuckled at the trivia. Lisa had barely reacted. They weren't old enough to have watched the show growing up, and it wasn't like a celebrity name meant anything supernatural. But from the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The air was thick with the scent of wood polish and something older, something musty, like an attic that had been sealed for decades. The house had been cleaned before they moved in, yet a fine layer of dust seemed to settle back onto surfaces within hours. At night, the quiet was almost suffocating. They had lived in cities for so long that the absence of car horns and sirens made every creak of the wooden floors feel deafening. Lisa was the first to notice the chair. It was a plain wooden rocking chair in the corner of the living room, left behind by the previous owners. She had planned to move it to the garage, but every morning it was slightly out of place. At first, she assumed it was Eric bumping into it, but one night, as she lay half asleep on the couch, she saw it rocking ever so slightly, as if someone had just risen from it. "Did you touch the chair?" she asked Eric the next morning. He frowned. "What chair?" Lisa didn't mention it again. A week later, they found the radio. It was an old transistor model, tucked away in a cabinet they hadn't explored yet. When Eric turned it on, static filled the room, followed by a burst of music, some old 1950s tune, crackling like it was coming from a long-lost signal. "Maybe it's picking up AM frequencies," Eric muttered, twisting the dial. The music faded, and then through the hiss of static, a voice. "Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale." The theme song, Gilligan's Island. Eric let out a laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." Lisa didn't laugh. She turned the radio off and shoved it back into the cabinet. That night, as she lay in bed, she could swear she heard the faint hum of the song drifting through the house. And then came the voice, a whisper right by her ear. "Help me." She shot up, gasping for air. The room was still. Lisa didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Lisa stood in the dimly lit hallway, her breath shallow, her pulse a quiet drumbeat in her ears. The house was silent now, too silent. She could still hear the whisper lingering in her mind, that faint, almost pleading "help me" that had jolted her awake. The room was dark except for the pale glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the sheer curtains and casting restless shadows on the walls. She turned toward Eric, lying on his side, his breathing deep and steady, unbothered, unaware. Lisa swallowed hard and forced herself to lie back down, staring at the ceiling. She listened for any sound beyond the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Nothing. Maybe she had dreamed it. Maybe the stress of the move and the unfamiliar creaks of an old house were playing tricks on her. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, she didn't mention the voice. She wanted to, but the words felt ridiculous even in her own head. Instead, she focused on unpacking, keeping herself busy as Eric worked on organizing the garage. The sun poured through the kitchen window, warming the wooden floors, making the house feel almost normal. Almost. That was until she saw the chair again. It had moved. Lisa stood frozen at the edge of the living room, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug in her hand. She knew exactly where she had left it the night before, facing the fireplace. Now it was angled toward the hallway, as if positioned deliberately, watching. "Eric?" she called out, her voice careful. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, wiping sweat from his brow with an old rag. "Yeah." She gestured toward the chair. "Did you move that?" Eric followed her gaze, then let out a dry chuckle. "I don't even think I've touched that thing." Lisa exhaled slowly. She wanted to believe him, But something about the way the chair had shifted, the precise way it was turned, it unsettled her. She tried to ignore it, tried to brush it off. But the house wouldn't let her. That night, the radio came back on. Lisa was halfway between sleep and wakefulness when the sound crackled through the darkness. A low hum, distorted and distant, like a station struggling to tune in. She bolted upright, her pulse quickening. Eric stirred beside her, groaning. "What the hell is that?" Lisa didn't answer. She was already slipping out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor as she followed the sound. It was coming from the living room. The radio sat on the coffee table, right where Eric had left it. The dials hadn't been touched, but the speaker buzzed with static, occasionally breaking into warbled fragments of old music. Lisa hesitated, her fingers hovering over the knob. The static was deafening up close, a chaotic symphony of white noise. But underneath it, just barely audible, there was something else. A voice. She turned the dial slowly, her stomach tightening. The static shifted, breaking apart, and for a split second, the sound was unmistakable. "Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale." Lisa's breath hitched. The theme song, Gilligan's Island. She snatched her hand away from the radio as if it had burned her. Eric, now fully awake, stepped beside her, rubbing his eyes. He frowned down at the radio before reaching out and twisting the knob. The music cut off with a sharp pop. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eric exhaled. Must have turned on by itself. Maybe a bad switch or something. Lisa wasn't convinced, because just as the radio went dead, she could have sworn she heard it again. A whisper, somewhere behind her. "Help me." The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unseen. A cold sensation brushed the back of her neck, and she turned sharply, expecting to see nothing. But the chair had moved again, and this time it was facing her. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house no longer felt like their own. Lisa noticed it in the small things at first, the way the air inside seemed cooler than outside, even on warm days, or how certain rooms carried a scent she couldn't quite place. Something old and stale, like a forgotten trunk in an attic. Eric was slower to admit anything was wrong. He was practical, logical. "It's an old house," he told her when she mentioned the strange occurrences. "Old houses creak, drafts move furniture a little, and that radio? Probably a short circuit." Lisa wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. Not after what happened next. It was late, close to midnight, the kind of quiet hour when the world outside was still, but the house was not. Lisa lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Beside her, Eric's breathing was steady, deep in sleep. Then she heard it, soft at first, a faint creak from the living room floorboards. She held her breath. Another creak, slow and deliberate, like the hesitant step of someone who didn't want to be heard. Lisa sat up, her heartbeat a dull thud against her ribs. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. Someone was in the living room. She nudged Eric. "Wake up." He groaned, barely shifting. Another creak. Closer this time. Lisa's stomach twisted into knots. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. She reached for the lamp, hesitating before turning it on. The moment the bulb flickered to life, the creaking stopped. Lisa strained her ears, waiting. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. She stood slowly, crossing the room, moving toward the door. It was half open, revealing a sliver of the darkened hallway beyond. Something moved, a flicker of shadow against the far wall, gone before she could fully register it. Lisa's breath hitched, then a loud bang. She gasped, nearly stumbling backward as the sound echoed through the house. Eric bolted upright, eyes wild with confusion. What the hell was that? Lisa didn't answer. She was already moving, her body tense with fear as she stepped into the hallway. The air felt different out here, thicker, colder. The dim glow of the street lamp outside barely reached this part of the house, casting long, uneven shadows. The rocking chair was moving. Lisa stopped in her tracks, her pulse roaring in her ears. It was slow, almost gentle, the wooden frame shifting back and forth with an invisible force. Eric appeared behind her, his presence grounding but no less confused. "Lisa!" Then the radio turned on. A sharp burst of static crackled through the house, cutting through the silence like a jagged knife. Lisa's breath came in short gasps as the station shifted on its own, moving through white noise and broken fragments of voices. And then laughter, high-pitched, unnatural, the sound of an old television broadcast. The words that followed sent an icy chill through her spine. And his first mate too, the theme song, again. But something was wrong. The voices weren't right. The cheerful melody was warped, distorted, dragging unnaturally slow as if being played from a decaying tape. The words slurred together, the pitch dropping lower and lower until the last lyric was a deep, guttural moan. Eric stepped forward, his jaw tight. He grabbed the radio, twisting the dial. Nothing changed. Lisa watched in frozen horror as the rocking chair suddenly stopped moving. The air went still. And then the whisper, "Help me." But this time it wasn't coming from the radio. It was behind her. Lisa turned sharply, her body rigid with fear. For the briefest of moments she saw it, a figure, a silhouette, just out of reach of the light. Too fast, too fleeting. But it was there. Then the bulb in the hallway flickered once, twice before plunging them into darkness. And the house exhaled. A long, heavy sigh, like someone had been holding their breath all this time. Lisa's scream died in her throat, because now she knew. They were not alone in Bob Denver House. The darkness pressed in around them. Lisa could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the heavy silence of the house stretching unnaturally, as if something unseen was waiting, watching. Eric stood beside her, his breath shallow, muscles tense. The hallway light, which had flickered moments ago, was now completely dead, leaving only the faintest glow seeping in from the street lamp outside. Lisa swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The figure, whatever she had seen, was gone. But she still felt it. The sensation was different this time. Not just a presence, but a weight, thick and suffocating, like standing in a room filled with invisible fog. The air itself seemed charged, static clinging to her skin, raising the fine hairs on her arms. The radio continued its low, distorted hum in the living room, its broken melody dragging through the silence. Then the whisper, right behind her ear, a breath, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." Lisa gasped and spun around, her hand clutching Eric's arm for balance. But there was nothing behind her. Eric exhaled sharply. "Lisa, we're leaving. Now." She didn't argue. With a shaky nod, she turned toward the hallway, her feet moving quickly. Eric followed, his movements stiff with tension. They reached the living room, and the air was even colder here, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The rocking chair sat motionless, exactly where it had stopped before. The radio, however, had changed. The static was gone. Now, a voice played through the speaker low, muffled, but unmistakable. A recording. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears as she listened. "I don't know how much time I have." Her breath caught. Something's wrong here. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. Lisa turned to Eric, her chest tightening. "That's..." Another loud bang, this time from the basement. The sound reverberated through the house, deep and hollow, like something massive had just slammed against the floor. Eric's expression hardened. "That's it. We're out of here." But as he grabbed Lisa's arm and turned toward the front door, they both froze. It was open, wide open, and standing in the doorway, just barely visible in the dim light, a figure, tall, motionless, a shadow of a man, his edges blurred as if the darkness itself clung to him. Lisa's breath hitched. She tried to move, but her legs locked in place. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out, but the figure didn't move, didn't advance. It only stood there, watching, and then it spoke, but not in words. The radio spoke for it. "Please help me." Lisa's fingers dug into Eric's wrist. Her voice barely found its way past her throat. "Bob!" The figure twitched, not stepped, not turned, twitched, like a glitch in reality, Its form jerked unnaturally, shifting forward a fraction of an inch without actually moving. The radio crackled again, warping. "Please!" The air collapsed inward. A sudden, crushing force surrounded them, like being pulled underwater. Lisa's lungs seized. Her vision blurred at the edges. She could feel something reaching, pressing against her skin, unseen but undeniable. Eric yanked her forward, breaking the trance. They bolted for the door. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air snapped back to normal. The heaviness vanished. The warmth of the humid night wrapped around them, starkly different from the freezing interior of the house. Lisa gasped for breath, doubling over, her heart hammering. Eric's hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his knuckles white. They turned. The house stood in eerie silence, the doorway yawning open behind them. But now there was no figure, only darkness, and the radio still playing. A 3-hour tour, then click. Silence. The house was waiting. Lisa knew without a doubt this wasn't over. They had seen it, and worse, it had seen them. The house stood in silence behind them. Lisa's legs trembled as she staggered back, her breath shallow. Eric reached for her, his grip firm but unsteady. The air outside felt thick with humidity, a stark contrast to the freezing stillness inside the house. The chirping of crickets, the distant rustling of trees, it should have been grounding, a reminder of the world beyond the nightmare they had just fled. But it wasn't, because the house wasn't done with them. Lisa turned, her gaze locked on the doorway, that gaping black maw that had swallowed them whole moments ago. The figure was gone. The radio had fallen silent. But something still lingered, unseen, waiting just beyond the threshold. Eric pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling as he scrolled through his contacts. "We're calling someone. I don't care if it's a priest, a psychic, or a damn demolition crew. This place is cursed." Lisa barely heard him. Her focus was on the window beside the door. A faint reflection glowed in the glass. Not hers, not Eric's, something else. A blurred face, features indistinct but unmistakably watching. Lisa's breath caught. "Eric!" Before she could finish, the front door slammed shut. The impact sent a deep, echoing boom through the night. The house seemed to vibrate, as if exhaling one final breath before sealing them out. The porch light flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving only darkness. Eric cursed under his breath, staring at the door. He raised a shaking hand, hesitating before stepping forward. He reached for the handle. Lisa grabbed his wrist. No, her voice was barely above a whisper. Eric hesitated, then pulled back. The door remained closed. The house was done with them, for now. 1 month later, Lisa sat in the back seat of the car, watching as the for sale sign was hammered into the dry, patchy grass of the front yard. Eric stood beside the realtor, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. They hadn't stepped foot inside since that night. The decision had been easy: sell the house. Get away. Pretend they had never lived here at all. But the house wouldn't let them forget. Every night since leaving, Lisa had the same dream. She was standing in the hallway. The air was thick, pressing against her skin like damp cloth. The radio was playing static, faint whispers, the distant hum of a voice she almost recognized. And then the figure. It was closer each time, reaching, waiting. She never stayed long enough to see what it wanted. Lisa shook herself from the thought, looking back at the house. The windows were dark, lifeless, but she felt it watching. The realtor turned, smiling. "There's already a few interested buyers. It shouldn't take long." Lisa didn't answer, because she knew, whoever moved in next, they wouldn't be alone. And when the radio played again, whispering its fractured message through the cold, empty rooms, the house would choose its next visitor, just like it had chosen them. The house remained empty for a while, but eventually someone else moved in. The rocking chair remained in its place. The radio sat untouched. The rooms were repainted, furniture replaced, the history of its former owners erased with a fresh coat of white. And yet, late at night, when the house was still, the new owners sometimes heard it. the soft creak of floorboards, the whisper of static drifting through the halls. And if they listened closely, a voice. Help me. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.